Today in the Rare Advisor, we're going to dive deep into the three phases that affect every financial advisory practice in existence. And the key is you must know the phase you are in order to apply the correct strategy for growth. Welcome to the Rare Advisor, a business model supercharged by recurring and repeatable events. My name is Mike Walters, and I'm sharing time today with Mr. Steve Phillips, longtime friend. And over the last couple of years, we've been lucky enough to actually be working together on the same team now. We've known each other forever. We were joking about that earlier. For those of you who are on the video version, there we are. Gosh, how many years ago? Look at the hair. That's all I have to say.
One of us looks the same and one of us doesn't look the same, Mike. I know that's why that's up there. Fantastic.
That's probably what, about circa 1990, maybe 1991, something like that. So today we want to chat with you about the three phases that every advisor finds himself in, regardless of how long they've been in practice. You are either in the acquisition phase where you're acquiring new clientele. You're in the expansion phase where it's about stabilizing, creating scale, and growing the business through expansion efforts. And then obviously the succession or the M&A phase, as the case might be, depending on how you're applying that component as well. And Steve, this is right in your wheelhouse. I know you coach and mentor many advisors on this on a daily basis. And so if you could start us off maybe with just kind of an overall explanation of the three phases, I think that would get us heading in the right direction.
Yeah, happy to do it. Thanks, Mike. And it's great to be on with you. And as we continue down the road, I'll work on getting more pictures that might be in my favor there. So, when we were talking about the collective experience that we have and really what's being offered by the industry. And we think about whether you're doing business with a broker dealer, an RIA, it's an IMO, all those types of things. Right. That one of the fallbacks that we have heard of late is that everybody has the idea. We've got our best practices. We've been doing this a long time. We know what you need, and you can buy this or do business with us and you'll get this or whatever it is. It's kind of this fallback position. And so talking to advisors, and indeed when we were working with the exec team at USA, all of us, there was a real disconnect there. And we thought, how on earth, maybe it is best practices, but until you know where my practice is, how do you know that best practice is going to affect me? And that's really where the conversation of the three phases came up. And so the team go ahead.
You say what's best practice for one person isn't even in the right stadium for someone else because they're at different stages of development within their practice.
Yeah, and that's well said. And so here's what happened. So you're right. So best practices for you are not best practices for me. But what we could accurately say is with all of the experience, I mean, really with the exec team, with you and Brent and all of us on the protocol side of things, I mean, it's hundreds of years and thousands of advisors. So while we can't say what works for me works for you, we can say that with the experience of thousands of advisors tells us that every practice is going to be in one of three places along its evolution. And so if we can pin that down, let's talk acquisition, as you said. Let's talk expansion. Let's talk succession. If we can figure out where you are, then we can apply best practices to where you are and where you want to go as a firm. And really, the idea that we are support, that we are helping to grow practices, I thought that all of us collectively getting together and going, let's find out where a firm or a team is, that's real collaboration. And the other thing that I wanted that you said in the opening about rare advisors, rare organization, the ancillary part of the three phases is this. We can come up with all kinds of tools. We can come up with all kinds of ideas. And then we've got 5,000 advisors and none of it ever gets implemented. And you and I both come from a history where that was the case. So the other thing that we talked about at USA was we come up with these three phases. Let's make sure that we still continue to focus on a fit. The advisors that fit with us then get to be really handheld. That's a bad implemented with accountability partners we become. So that when we identify these opportunities and challenges, we're walking through this with our advisors that are fit. So I think it makes more sense. And we certainly have seen a much better reception to it.
Sure. And the first thing you need to really do is wrap your mind around what do these phases represent, because oftentimes you might find you're actually straddling between two different phases. So they're not necessarily mutually exclusive either, but the first one, acquisition, what we're really referring to is client and asset acquisition. We're not talking about going on and acquiring another practice. We can discuss that down the road with succession and M&A. But on this front terminology that we're using of the term acquisition, we're really talking about growing your practice through client and asset acquisition. So that, again, put your mind and kind of wrap it around that first step. The second step is then business scale and expansion. So you've got some traction, you got your legs underneath you, you've figured out how to bring people into the practice. But now the question is, are we bringing the right people into the practice? Are we duplicating our best clients? And are we able to replicate the types of relationships that really are most important to the firm? And so that would be that expansion section. And then that third piece would be the succession, including what I would call M&A. So whether it's succession, meaning transitioning for your practice, or ultimately one day you're going to transition out, or you're transitioning someone else in, or you're actually making an acquisition because you're going to grow through those acquisitions, all of that can kind of fall into this third category. So when you lay the three out, then you suddenly see how you can kind of be straddling between two or even more. I guess you could, in theory, I guess you could really have a presence in all three if the circumstances were exactly right. But generally speaking, you're probably straddling between one and two. You're kind of on the verge of you're getting the acquisition piece, you've got good client flow, but now you need to understand expansion. Or you've been on the expansion phase for a while, and now you're contemplating either succession or maybe growth through an M&A or an acquisition. And so it's a matter of zeroing in on where you fit in this to identify what are going to be the best practices for you and your firm.
That's all of that's really well said. What's really cool about the collaboration with you and doing this particular series is that I'm big on the words matter. That's a whole approach for our practice management and business refinement processes. And the idea of acquisition, and you talk about client acquisition and assets, and there's a little bit of a separation there. You're right that the phases do overlap. And typically we see, first of all, I think acquisition never goes out of style. When you think of client acquisition, and we'll talk about that more in a future session, think of client acquisition, it certainly affects the ability to expand the organization. And even in succession, I think when you're selling the practice or handing it down or mergers and acquisitions that you've talked about, the idea of making sure that we maintain current relationships is important. But acquisition, we don't find advisors that are buying practices. They're buying for acquisition and also doing the initiatives that would bring on new relationships. So we see a lot of this between 1 and 2, acquisition and expansion. Between 2 and 3, expansion and succession. Because if you're expanding and growing and scaling the practice, it ultimately leads to succession. And then if there was one that was going to touch all three, probably is acquisition. And it's the description that you use. Client acquisition, always in style. When you start talking about assets, you talk about mergers and acquisitions there. I think it just takes on a whole bigger scope. And even from that 30,000 foot, then I think advisors can see, well, wait a minute. If you could name a fourth category that a practice ever exists in, I'd be curious to know what it is. Yeah. Because as we crunch that, even it'll end up in being one of these three. Right. So it's find out where you are and then apply the tools to move you along.
And again, just to kind of add to your analogy there, you don't think of this as being linear, right? Because when you get to the succession phase, you now automatically kind of default back to the acquisition phase. Because let's say you're transitioning out of the business and the next generation is taking over, well, that next generation probably wasn't where you were on the expansion side, and they might need to build their book of business again. So suddenly you've got succession going on, but then that triggers acquisition again. And the same thing with an M&A. If you're growing through acquisition, once you acquire that new practice that you're purchasing, suddenly you have to go right back to your acquisition strategies, because now it's about client and asset acquisition, making sure that transition works correctly. So I always think of it kind of like that recycle emblem, right? Where it's got the three corners and they're always kind of circling about each other. That's really how this works when you're talking about acquisition, expansion, and succession.
I couldn't agree. Listen, I don't know that we ever, when we're working with we'll find advisors, certainly in the protocol division, that are in one of those three phases, that we verbalize it quite that way, but it couldn't be more accurate because it does come forward and then go backwards. And I think that, again, there are only three phases. They'll overlap, then they work backwards. And your point to, if you are an advisor that's selling the practice, the advisor that's buying the practice probably is back in acquisition or expansion, as you mentioned. And then the ability to continually update the tools and find the initiatives that really provide, we talk about, and we're going to, as I mentioned before, we'll talk about this more in the upcoming episodes that we break down the three, but each of the phases has, I don't like the word, I guess there are challenges. We sort of talk about issues, things that have to be addressed. None of them are deal breakers or real rocket science, but what really exists in all three phases is opportunities.
Right.
And, we use the phrase a lot, opportunity gaps. Once you know where you are, recognize and typically the challenges, those are things that advisors and firms are already doing well, that they need to do a little bit more of or more efficiently. So the whole idea of we'll have to come up with our own little recycle emblem for the three phases. That's a great one. Yeah, it's good. And I think it's appropriate.
So this series is called The Rare Advisor. It's a business model that's supercharged by recurring and repeatable events. We're just scratching the surface at the very high level of how the structure of your practice really sets the stage for such recurring and repeatable events. And that's what we're talking about today with the acquisition, expansion, and succession. I would ask you to do us a favor. If this is information you like, if this is helpful to you, please be sure that you like, you subscribe, you comment, whether you're watching on video, whether you're listening by podcast. The more you're involved with this, the better the content continues to get. So we appreciate that very much. And if you are interested and find this intriguing, what we're talking about now, I would encourage you check out the next in the series. We're going to be diving deep on the acquisition phase in particular, growing your business through client and asset acquisition. So Steve, thanks so much for your time today. Everyone else, again, please like, subscribe, and comment, and we'll be staying tuned and chatting with you again real soon. Thanks for everything.